Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context. Today we're going deep into the Congressional Record, specifically from March 21st, 2025. You sent us some really interesting stuff, and we want to figure out what it all means about how Congress operates.
Yeah, this isn't just some, history lesson. It's like looking right into the engine room of our legislative branch. I mean, we've got a lot to work with here. I mean, everything from the opening prayer to the rules committees use, how the House itself operates, bits of the U.S. Code that are relevant, messages from the White House and the administration, brand new bills, people getting shout-outs for doing great stuff, even updates on what different committees are up to and a temporary speaker being appointed. So it's really a pretty complete picture of a day in Congress.
All right, so let's break this down. Today, we're going to focus on how things work procedurally, like how committees do their jobs, how they keep tabs on things, and what's in place to keep things transparent. But we're also going to look at all the different things that are part of the Congressional Record, from proposing new laws to, like you said, recognizing people who are doing good work in their communities.
When you first crack open this Congressional Record, the first thing you see is a prayer. It's right at the beginning. It kind of sets a certain tone, doesn't it? I mean, this specific prayer from March 21st talks about how divine words are pure and how we should be protected from harmful speech and how we should support people who are vulnerable.
It's a pretty stark contrast, I mean, you have this call for respectful and ethical communication, and then right after that, you often have these heated and sometimes very pointed debates. I mean, that's kind of the hallmark of legislative proceedings, right? It really makes you think about the ideals people bring to the table compared to, how politics actually plays out in reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a little reminder, that even when people in Congress have strong disagreements, there are still these underlying hopes and aspirations. And then when we dig into how committees operate, this document really lays it all out. We see all these details about how they form subcommittees and what those subcommittees are supposed to do.
Right. Each subcommittee has its own specific area to focus on. And importantly, it has this ongoing responsibility to look at how well laws in its area are actually working. So it's not just about passing laws and then moving on, right? There's a built-in system to evaluate things down the line.
And that whole process of referring bills and resolutions, that's a key part of this. The committee chair has a lot of power there, deciding which subcommittee gets to handle which piece of legislation. But the really interesting part is that the chair can actually take a bill back from a subcommittee or even reassign it to a different one if they feel like things are stuck or there's no agreement in sight. That really highlights how important the chair's role is and how much influence they have.
It does. It shows that even though the subcommittees handle a lot of the initial work, digging into the details, the chair is like the manager, making sure everything is moving along as it should. And then we see the general process that subcommittees follow. It's pretty structured. They have meetings, they hold hearings to get input from different people, they have markups to fine-tune the language of the bills, and then finally they send their recommendations to the full committee.
And there's a rule here that I think is worth pointing out. It says a subcommittee can't have a meeting or hearing at the same time as the full committee, which makes sense, right? I mean, you wouldn't want members having to choose between two important discussions happening at the same time. So this makes sure everyone has the chance to participate in the most crucial parts of the process.
Absolutely. And even scheduling those hearings and meetings, that also needs the committee chair's approval. So again, it reinforces that central authority. Then we get into the requirements for giving notice and setting the agenda, which really show that they're trying to be open and transparent.
Yeah, this is really important for transparency. The rule is that every single committee member has to get a memo at least 3 days before any meeting or hearing. And this memo has to lay out exactly what the meeting is about, who the witnesses are going to be, some background info on them, and why they're appearing. And it's not just about the majority party either. The ranking minority member, who, by the way, is like the leader of the minority party folks on the committee, which makes them really important in bipartisan discussions. They're in charge of providing that same kind of information for any witnesses that the minority side requests. This helps make sure that everybody has the information they need to be prepared and participate fully.
So it sounds like there's at least a system in place to make sure everyone is in the loop, at least on paper. Now let's talk about questioning witnesses, because that's obviously a big part of getting information during these hearings. And it looks like there's this standard 5-minute rule for each member.
Right, that's the default. But the rules also allow for longer questioning times. So if somebody makes a motion, then a certain number of members from both the majority and the minority, or even staff members they designate, can question a witness for a longer time. And it has to be equal time for both sides, up to a total of 30 minutes per side each time they do this. This gives them a chance to dig deeper into more complex issues.
And it's actually the person running the committee at that moment and the ranking minority member who get to decide how that extra time gets used by their side. So they have a big say in shaping how those deeper investigations play out.
Exactly. It gives both parties a way to really get into the nitty-gritty if they think it's important. Oh, and there's also this practical aspect. Witnesses are usually asked to submit their written statements a day ahead of time, if they can. This lets the committee members read the testimony in advance so they can come up with more focused questions.
And then, to make things official, witnesses can be sworn in. They take that oath, promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's actually spelled out right here in the Congressional Record, really emphasizes how serious it is to provide information to Congress.
It does, and it also ties into those sections of the U.S. Code that are included in our materials, like 18 U.S.C. Section 1621, which deals with perjury. So yeah, there are some serious legal ramifications if someone knowingly lies to Congress. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about committee records and the whole idea of transparency.
Yeah, this feels like a really important part of building public trust. The rules are clear that committees and subcommittees have to keep complete records of everything they do, even down to how each member voted on any issue during their business meetings. And these records aren't kept under lock and key. They have to be available for anyone to see, right in the committee offices, during normal business hours.
And the rules emphasize that these original records have to be preserved, no unauthorized changes or anything like that. The goal is to maintain an accurate and trustworthy account of what the committee did. This level of transparency is supposed to allow the public and anyone else who's interested to follow along with the legislative process closely and understand how decisions are made.
So it sounds like there are systems in place to make things open and accountable. Now, the Congressional Record also highlights this vital oversight role that committees have. It's not just about making new laws. It's also about making sure that the laws that are already on the books are actually working the way they're supposed to, and if they're effective.
Absolutely. House Rule X, which is referenced here, outlines the general oversight responsibilities of all those standing committees. They're basically tasked with constantly looking at how federal laws are being applied, administered, executed, and whether they're actually achieving the goals they were designed for. They also need to be looking out for problems or new situations that might signal a need for new or updated laws. So it's a continuous cycle of making laws and then checking to see if they're doing what they're supposed to do.
And the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, they have a particularly broad mandate in this area, don't they? I mean, they can review the activities of the government at all levels, including the president's office, and they examine reports from the Comptroller General, who leads the Government Accountability Office.
Right. Their scope isn't limited to just specific policy areas like some of the other committees. They can investigate pretty much anything related to how the government functions. And any committee that has more than 20 members is required to either create a dedicated oversight subcommittee or assign those duties to one of their existing subcommittees. This ensures that this really crucial function of holding the government accountable doesn't get neglected.
And then there's mention of these panels and task forces. It seems like these are kind of temporary specialized groups within the larger committees.
Yeah, they are. The chair has the power to create them to handle very specific tasks or issues. And one interesting thing is that both the chair and the ranking minority member are automatically members of all these panels and task forces. So both parties are always represented. And the same rules that govern how subcommittee meetings and hearings work also apply to these groups. However, they have a time limit. They can only exist for 6 months unless the chair decides to renew them. This suggests they're meant to be focused and short-term by design.
Okay, now let's talk about deposition authority. This seems like a pretty powerful tool that committees can use when they're doing investigations.
It is. So the chair, after talking with a ranking minority member, can order a deposition. Basically, it's like taking sworn testimony, but outside of a formal hearing setting. And this can even involve issuing subpoenas, which are legal orders that require someone to show up and testify. There are specific rules about giving notice, like the ranking minority member has to get 3 days' notice and a copy of any planned subpoena. All the committee members also get 3 days written notice, except in really urgent situations.
And when it comes to who actually asks the questions during a deposition, it can be the members themselves, or they can designate lawyers to do it. And those lawyers can represent either the majority or the minority party. But if they use lawyers, there's a limit of 2 per side during each round of questioning. I guess that keeps things focused and manageable.
Right, exactly. It helps keep things organized and efficient. And the rules are really specific about how that testimony is handled. It gets recorded, transcribed, reviewed by the witness to make sure it's accurate, and then it's formally filed. Witnesses can suggest changes to the transcript, but any big changes have to be explained in writing. And importantly, releasing any of that deposition material requires both the chair and the ranking minority member to agree. If either one of them objects, then the whole committee has to decide. This is like a built-in check to make sure things are fair and prevent someone from just releasing sensitive information on their own.
So even with a tool like this, there are these safeguards in place. Now, looking at some of the key points in these selected House rules, a few interesting things stand out.
For sure. Like the fact that motions to take a break or skip the official reading of a bill, if everybody's got a copy, those are considered privileged motions. That just shows how they try to streamline things and be efficient. But maybe even more important is that each standing committee is required to have its own set of written rules, like a rule book for how that committee does business. And these rules can't contradict the overall House rules, of course. So it lets committees have some flexibility to tailor things to their needs, but within a consistent framework that applies across the whole House.
And committees are required to have these regular meeting days at least once a month. Plus, the chair can call for extra meetings whenever they need to, and they have to designate a vice chair from the majority party to run things when the chair isn't there so that the committee can keep working without interruption.
What really stands out, though, in these House rules is, again, that focus on keeping accurate records and being transparent. Committees have to keep complete records of everything they do, including word-for-word transcripts of their meetings and hearings, and how each member voted on every single issue. And those voting records, showing exactly how each member voted, have to be posted online and made public within 48 hours. The only exception is for those confidential executive sessions of the Ethics Committee. Making those voting records public that quickly, that's a big step toward accountability because it allows constituents to see exactly how their representatives are voting on important matters.
Yeah, having that fast turnaround for making those votes public, that does seem like a significant move towards more transparency. And it's interesting that they have that rule against proxy voting in committees. Members have to actually be there in person to cast their votes. Really underscores that they want direct participation in those decisions.
It does. It reinforces that idea of being directly involved and taking personal responsibility. And the rules about open meetings and hearings are really specific. In general, everything a committee does has to be open to the public. That includes radio, TV, and photography coverage. Those closed-door sessions, the executive sessions where the public isn't allowed, those are only permitted in very specific situations. Things like when they're talking about national security stuff, or sensitive law enforcement investigations, or if someone's reputation could be unfairly damaged. Even for those closed sessions, they have to have a formal vote, and a majority of the committee has to be there. So they're always trying to balance the public's right to know with the need to keep some things confidential when it's necessary. It's something that comes up a lot in how Congress operates.
It does seem like they've put a lot of effort into finding that balance between the public's right to know and the need to protect confidentiality when it's really sensitive. And the rules for announcing those committee meetings and hearings are pretty clear, too. They want to make sure the public knows when and what's going to be discussed.
Right. The date, time, place, and the specific topic of the meeting or hearing, all that has to be announced publicly. And there's this really interesting rule about witnesses who aren't government officials. If they appear before a committee, they have to disclose any federal grants or contracts they've received, and also any contracts or payments from foreign governments, as long as it's related to what the hearing is about. And that information is made public too. It's all about being transparent about potential conflicts of interest and understanding who might be trying to influence the process.
That's a pretty serious disclosure requirement. It could definitely help shed some light on any potential biases or hidden agendas that people testifying might have. There's also a rule that lets the chair postpone a discussion and then pick it back up later, with continued opportunities for debate and amendments. I guess that gives them a way to deal with really complex or controversial issues so they have enough time to consider everything.
Right, it gives them some flexibility and makes sure that important topics aren't rushed through without proper discussion. And another important thing, members of the minority party have the right to call their own witnesses to testify. That's crucial to make sure a wider range of viewpoints are presented and considered.
Yeah, that's a key protection to make sure the minority's voice is heard and that the committee gets a more complete picture of the issues. And when committees write up their reports on legislation, they have to include any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. That way, different opinions on a bill are officially recorded and taken into consideration.
Exactly. It's not just the majority's viewpoint that becomes part of the official record. And committees have the power to do business, which includes issuing subpoenas if they need to, but that usually requires a majority vote within the committee. Of course, the Ethics Committee is a little different. They have stricter rules.
There's also this really interesting requirement for committees to hold at least one hearing every 120 days that's specifically about finding any waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement in government programs. And they're especially supposed to look at reports from inspectors general or the comptroller general. So they're constantly being reminded to keep an eye on how things are being run and make sure taxpayer money is being used properly.
Yeah, and they're also required to hold hearings whenever an agency gets what's called a disclaimer of opinion on their financial statements from their auditors, and also on government programs that are considered high risk by the Comptroller General. So those are like regular checkups to make sure things are running smoothly and that the government is being responsible with its money. Then there are the rules about media coverage of open committee meetings.
The main goal seems to be to educate the public and provide good information so people can get accurate, unbiased news coverage. And they're not supposed to have any commercial sponsorship, so it's all about making what goes on in Congress more accessible to everyone.
And there are guidelines about how many cameras are allowed and how those camera spots are assigned to different news organizations. So there's a lot of thought put into how the media covers those proceedings. Finally, when it comes to committee procedures, there's mention of paying witnesses for their time and travel, when they come testify. And the committee chairs are responsible for promptly reporting any measures that their committee approves. Bills that don't get a recommendation for passage are basically shelved, which usually means the House won't consider them. And as we've talked about, those minority views and how everyone voted, all that's included in the committee reports. They also try to make sure that transcripts of the hearings are available before the whole House votes on a bill.
So looking at all these rules, it's really obvious that there's a huge emphasis on process, transparency, and making sure that both the majority and the minority parties have their rights protected within the committee system. Now, there are also some other relevant parts of the U.S. Code mentioned in the Congressional Record. How do those fit in?
Yeah, those U.S. Code sections are kind of like the broader legal foundation for a lot of these procedures and powers we've been talking about. For example, there's 5 U.S.C. Section 552A, which is part of the Privacy Act. It has this exception that lets federal agencies share records with either the House of Representatives or the Senate or with their committees. That's really important for congressional oversight and investigations because it gives them the information they need to do their job.
And 5 U.S.C. Section 2302 protects federal employees who share information with Congress. That's really important for whistleblowers because it means they can report wrongdoing without being afraid of retaliation. And it also helps Congress get information directly from the executive branch without interference.
Exactly. And 5 U.S.C. Section 2954 makes it clear that executive agencies have to provide information when certain House and Senate committees request it. Similarly, 5 U.S.C. Section 7211 specifically protects the right of federal employees to petition Congress or give Congress information. These laws are all about making sure Congress has access to the information it needs to do its job effectively.
Then there's this whole group of criminal laws that are mentioned, like laws against making false statements to the government, obstructing congressional proceedings, tampering with witnesses, and perjury. These are serious laws with serious consequences for anyone who tries to interfere with the work of Congress.
Right. And 28 U.S.C. Section 535 outlines this requirement that federal agencies have to report any potential federal crimes involving government officials or employees to the Attorney General. So there's a system for dealing with potential criminal activity within the government. And then we have several sections that deal with the Comptroller General and the Government Accountability Office, like 31 U.S.C. Sections 712, 717, and 719. These highlight the GAO's really important role in auditing government spending, making sure government programs are effective, and reporting directly to Congress. And finally, 31 U.S.C. Section 1113 requires the president to cooperate with Congress and provide information to certain congressional committees when they request it. So all these U.S. code sections basically provide the legal framework and the teeth for Congress to oversee the executive branch and hold it accountable.
So those sections of the U.S. Code give Congress the legal authority and the tools to carry out oversight and get the information it needs. Now, there's also this section in the Congressional Record called Communications from the Executive Branch, or ECs. What can we learn from those?
These are basically formal reports and communications that different executive branch agencies send to House committees. On this particular day, March 21st, 2025, we see a bunch of them coming in from places like the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Justice Department, and even the Judicial Conference. They cover a lot of different topics, like 6-month updates on national emergencies, dealing with things like foreign meddling in our elections, what's happening in Somalia, and actions related to Russia. There's also a final report on this situation in the West Bank. There's a report on data mining activities by federal agencies and a memo from the Justice Department about limitations on removing administrative law judges. And there are even recommendations from the Administrative Conference of the United States and recommendations from the Judicial Conference about creating new federal judgeships. It really shows you how much information is constantly flowing back and forth between the executive and legislative branches and how much reporting the executive branch has to do.
It really highlights the ongoing dialogue and the mechanisms for accountability that are supposed to be happening between the two branches. And then we have this pretty long list of introduced bills and resolutions. What can we take away from these?
This section is like a snapshot of the legislative priorities and the concerns that individual members of Congress had on their minds that day. We see bills introduced on a huge variety of topics, everything from requiring reports on violent attacks against law enforcement to proposed changes to the National Labor Relations Act about secret ballot elections. There are bills about preventing discrimination against unborn babies diagnosed with Down syndrome, a bill about transferring some federal land in North Dakota, a bill to let federal law enforcement officers buy their old service weapons when they retire, and even a resolution to make a specific day National Rosie the Riveter Day.
Wow, that is a broad range of issues. There are also bills about oversight of Homeland Security, changes to the Fair Labor Standards Act, healthcare, background checks for firearms, veterans issues, product labeling, support for volunteer firefighters, and a whole bunch of stuff about education. It really shows how many different things Congress is dealing with every single day. And it's important to note that each of these bills cites the specific part of the Constitution that gives Congress the power to make laws on that particular subject. That's a fundamental part of how our system of government works. Congress can't just pass laws about anything. They have to be able to point to a specific power granted to them in the Constitution.
Right, that's one of the core principles of our Constitution, the idea of limited government. Congress has to have a legal basis for the laws it passes. And then we get to the extensions of remarks, which I always find really interesting.
Me too. This is where members of Congress can put statements, tributes, and other things into the official congressional record that weren't actually spoken on the House floor. It's a way to formally recognize people, events, and achievements.
And we see a ton of different examples of these on March 21st, 2025. There's a tribute honoring the life and work of Hayes Cooper, who has a school named after him. There's a resolution to declare March as Zoroastrian Legacy and Heritage Month, which highlights the contributions of that community throughout history. And they recognize the 25th anniversary of the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, which commemorates an important part of our history.
And then a whole bunch of personal tributes to people who are making a difference in their communities. People like Mickey Parker from Jackson State University, Diane Wrights for her work with veterans, ULIS Public Service Officer Russell Carter on his retirement, and Liberty County Manager Joey Brown for his public service. It's a real mix of people doing all sorts of good things.
And there are some shout-outs to educators, like Dr. Cordella Shigog-Smith, achievements of student athletes, like the CSD Vikings boys basketball team, and acknowledgments of milestones, like Sergeant David Laredo turning 100, and the 100th anniversary of Pine Beach, New Jersey. There's recognition for folks dedicated to important public service, like Shannon Starzik's work with domestic violence survivors, and even tributes to historical figures like Captain Roberto Chito Samaniego, who was the first service member from El Paso killed in action in Vietnam. So members of Congress use this section to connect with their constituents and honor people in all sorts of ways.
It does. It adds this human element to the congressional record, you know. It goes beyond all the legislative language and the rules of procedure. We also see a resolution to designate April 29th as #EndJewHatred Day. And shout-outs for local heroes like Dr. Katie Simpson and Joseph Bongarzone. It really shows the wide range of things that are important to people across the country and that members of Congress bring to the nation's attention through the congressional record.
Right. And there are more tributes for people like Bill Whitney, who works with the Building and Construction Trades Council, Staff Sergeant Omar Alonzo Ramiro for his military service, and the Greater Mount Pleasant Missionary Baptist Church for its long history of service in the community. It reminds us how many different parts of community life Congress interacts with and acknowledges.
And finally, we come to committee reports. This tells us about bills that have made it through the committee process and are getting closer to being considered by the whole House.
Yeah. On this day, we see a report on H.R. 1789, which has to do with removing certain actions against presidents and other top officials. And they note that it was approved by the committee with an amendment. There's also a report on H.R. 195, which was a call for an investigation into how the Social Security Administration operates. That one got an adverse report, meaning the committee doesn't recommend that the House approve it. And lastly, there's a report on H.R. 875, which is about rules for not allowing or deporting non-citizens who are convicted of DUI. That one also has an amendment.
So those committee reports show us which bills are moving forward and which ones are hitting a wall at the committee level. And then at the very end, we see that Representative Easel was appointed as Speaker pro tempore for the day.
Right. That's a pretty routine thing, but still important. It means Representative Easel is temporarily filling in for the Speaker of the House and has all their powers and responsibilities for that day. It makes sure the House can keep working smoothly even when the Speaker isn't available.
Okay, so let's step back for a second and think about what all this means for you, the average person who wants to be informed and engaged. Looking at just one day in the congressional record, it gives us a really valuable peek behind the curtain, beyond the headlines we usually see. We can see all the rules and procedures that form the basis of how our laws are made and how the government works.
Yeah, it's clear that they really emphasize transparency, things like requiring open meetings, recording all the votes, and making those committee records available for anyone to look at. And you also get a sense of how much information is supposed to be constantly moving between the executive branch and Congress. It's this constant back and forth.
And the sheer variety of bills that are introduced, plus those heartfelt tributes and the extensions of remarks, it really highlights how many different issues and concerns Congress has to deal with. It's not just the big, attention-grabbing policy debates. It's also about recognizing people and what they're doing in communities all across the country.
And that leads us to a really important question for all of you listening. How can you use this knowledge about the congressional record and how Congress operates to become more informed and more involved? A good place to start might be to check out the websites for the specific House committees that focus on the things you care about the most. You can usually find their meeting schedules, their agendas, and even transcripts of past hearings right there on their sites.
Or maybe you could jump right into the congressional record itself and search for the debates and votes related to topics you're interested in. After all, it's a public document. And it's a first-hand account of what's happening in Congress, told in the words of the people who are actually there making the decisions.
Exactly. When you understand the process and know where to find information, you can be a more effective participant in our democracy. You can understand how laws get made and how your representatives are working for you.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into this snapshot of the congressional record. We hope you learned something new and that you have a better understanding of the inner workings of the U.S. Congress.